Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The evening stretched over the rolling hills of Connacht, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet as the last light of the sun kissed the land. A gentle breeze whispered through the ancient oaks, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant rain. At the edge of a still lake, where mist curled like ghostly fingers upon the water, Prince Leary reined in his steed. His men followed suit, their horses snorting softly, the sound muffled by the thickening fog that rose from the water's surface. Leary, though young, carried himself with the quiet confidence of one who had seen battle and emerged wiser for it. His dark hair, damp with sweat from the long ride, clung to his forehead as he surveyed the eerie stillness before him. They had been tracking a band of outlaws who had raided the western villages of his father's kingdom. For days, they had pursued them, their trail winding through the untamed forests and into the wilds beyond the known lands. Yet now, the trail had gone cold. Braddon, Leary's most trusted warrior, dismounted beside him, his broad frame tense with frustration. A scar ran down his cheek, a remnant of an old skirmish, and his sharp gaze swept over the mist-laden landscape. They vanished into the trees, he muttered, shaking his head. We'd be fools to follow in this light. The forest will swallow us whole. Leary exhaled, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness in his muscles. He despised abandoning a hunt, but Braddon was right. The mist moved strangely here, shifting in unnatural patterns, curling around their legs like a living thing. It set his teeth on edge. We make camp here, Leary decided. Set a watch, but let the men rest. We ride at first light. His warriors, men hardened by battle and loyal to their prince, obeyed without hesitation. They moved swiftly, kindling a fire and unfurling their thick woolen blankets. The scent of roasting meat soon mingled with the damp, earthy aroma of the lake. Laughter and low voices filled the night as the men exchanged tales of past victories and old loves. Yet beneath it all, an unspoken unease settled among them, a weight none dared voice. Leary sat apart, his gaze fixed on the lake's glassy surface. The mist thickened, undisturbed by wind, its curling tendrils reaching outward as if seeking something unseen. Aeon, an older warrior who had fought beside Leary's father, settled onto a nearby log. His grizzled beard was streaked with silver, his eyes knowing. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers glow. You feel it, don't you? Aeon murmured. Leary glanced at him, then back at the lake. Something is wrong, Aeon grunted. There are places in this world where the veil grows thin, where one step in the wrong direction can take a man far beyond the land he knows. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of old stories, of warnings passed down through generations. Step too far from the fire, lad, and figure, tall, unmoving, its form barely distinguishable from the mist itself. Leary's hand went to his sword. Aeon exhaled slowly. "Well, lad," he murmured, his voice steady despite the weight of the unknown pressing against them. "It seems the night has only just begun." The mist curled around the figure, obscuring its shape like a shroud woven from night itself. The firelight flickered against the damp air, casting restless shadows that stretched toward the lake's edge. Leary rose to his feet, his grip tightening on the hilt of his sword, though he did not yet draw it. His breath misted before him, the chill in the air deepening. Behind him, his warriors had fallen silent. The easy laughter of earlier had drained away, leaving only the soft crackle of the fire and the distant lapping of water against the shore. One by one, they turned toward the apparition standing at the water's edge, their hands instinctively seeking their weapons. "Who goes there?" Leary's voice rang clear across the stillness, steady despite the unease curling in his gut. For a moment, there was no response. The mist swirled, twisting in slow, deliberate motions. Then the figure stepped forward. It moved with an unsettling grace, its footfalls making no sound against the damp earth. As it neared the fire's glow, the light caught the flowing cloak it wore, shimmering like silver caught in moonlight. Beneath the hood, the figure's features sharpened, ageless yet noble, bearing the weight of years beyond mortal reckoning. His hair was dark, long, and swept behind his shoulders, and his eyes gleamed with an eerie knowing. "I am Finian, son of Wrath," the stranger intoned. His voice was deep, resonant, carrying with it the weight of distant storms. "I come seeking aid." Leary did not lower his hand from his sword's hilt. He exchanged a glance with Aeon, who remained unmoving, watching with an unreadable expression. Behind them, the other warriors had drawn closer, their hands on their weapons, uncertain whether this was man or specter. "Are you friend or foe?" Leary asked. Finian studied him for a long moment before inclining his head. "I come not to raise a blade against you, but to ask for the aid of mortal warriors. I am of the realm beyond the land your people call the Otherworld." His gaze swept across the gathered men. "And I have need of those willing to tread where others fear to go." A hush fell over the warriors. Some stiffened at the name, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Stories of that place were as old as time whispers of a land of endless youth, of music and wonder, of gods and monsters. Few mortals ever crossed into it, and those who did rarely returned. Leary's grip on his sword remained firm. "What need have you of mortal warriors?" Finian's cloak stirred as if caught in an unseen current. He took another step forward, the mist parting around him like a living thing. "My wife was taken from me," he said, his voice quieter now, edged with sorrow. "Stolen by a man named Yuan, son of Saul, a warlord from beyond the veil." Leary's expression did not change, though his mind sharpened at the weight of those words. "I sought her, and I found her captor Finian was not finished. His jaw tensed, his gaze distant. But my wife fled. She has fallen into the hands of Gale, son of Dahlin, a ruler of Ire, another realm of the otherworld. 7 times I have fought to reclaim her. 7 times I have waged war upon his people. And 7 times I have been repelled. Braddon exhaled sharply, skepticism flickering in his eyes. If you who come from the other world could not defeat them, why do you seek us? Finian's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but there was no amusement in it. Because I have already failed in all the ways I know. His piercing gaze met Leary's. Mortal hands may yet succeed where mine have failed. Leary was silent. A warrior from the other world. A battle against phantoms. A wife stolen away. It sounded like something from a bard's tale, a story sung over a fire on a winter's night. And yet here was Finian, standing before him, real as the earth beneath his feet. What do you offer in return? Leary asked at last. Finian's expression remained unchanged. Gold, silver, treasures beyond imagining. His head tilted slightly. But I suspect you seek something more than riches. He stepped closer, his sharp gaze studying Leary, as if measuring something unseen. If you take this road, you will walk beyond what you know beyond kings, beyond the weight of duty. Leary held his gaze. His heart beat slow and steady, but the words stirred something deep inside him, something restless, something yearning. He had fought wars, hunted outlaws, seen blood spilled on both sides. But this was different. This was a road unwalked by most men. He did not answer right away. Instead, he turned to his warriors, measuring their faces. Some looked uneasy, others intrigued. All of them were waiting for his decision. I will return by morning, Finian said at last. You have until then to decide. And then, before their eyes, he stepped back into the mist. It swallowed him whole. For a long moment, no one spoke. Braddon let out a low whistle, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, he muttered, that's not something you see every day. Leary exhaled slowly. His fingers still curled around the hilt of his sword. Something told him this was only the beginning. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the gathered warriors. The mist still hung thick around the lake, curling through the trees like unseen hands, muffling the world beyond. Leary sat apart, his hands resting on his knees, his mind turning over the stranger's words. Aeon sat nearby, his cloak wrapped tightly around him against the night's chill. He had not spoken since Finian had disappeared, though Leary could tell the old warrior was awake. The quiet between them was comfortable, as it always was, but Leary knew Aeon was waiting for the moment his prince would speak. Finally, Leary exhaled and broke the silence. frowned, but said nothing. Aeon chuckled softly, shaking his head. I've known you since you were a boy, lad. I've seen you weigh choices like this before, even when you were too young to realize it. You sit quiet, thinking it over, but your heart's already decided. You're just waiting for your mind to catch up. Leary dragged a hand down his face, glancing out at the mist. This isn't like any other choice I've made, Aeon. This isn't some war against raiders or a battle for land. This is something else. Aye, it is, Aeon nodded. And that's why you're going to go. Leary gave him a sharp look, but the old warrior just smirked, throwing another twig into the fire. This isn't just about the promise of silver and treasure, Aeon continued. Leary shook his head. No. Aeon's expression softened slightly. It's about something bigger, something you don't fully understand yet, but you feel it, don't you? That pull, that sense that there's something beyond the horizon you've never seen before. Leary didn't answer, but he didn't have to. The truth was there in his silence. Aeon sighed and leaned back, staring up at the sky. It's a rare thing for a man to find a path that leads somewhere truly new. Most men live and die walking the same roads as those before them. But every so often, the world opens up just a little, and a choice appears. And that, my boy, is when a man decides what kind of story he'll leave behind. Leary clenched his jaw, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest. It wasn't just about gold. It wasn't just about battle. It was about being part of something greater than himself. He had spent his whole life fighting wars that had been fought before, treading paths that had already been walked. But this was a road unmarked. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't just following in his father's footsteps. He was about to take a step into something entirely unknown. A movement behind him made him glance over his shoulder. Braddon had risen from his place near the fire, his arms crossed over his chest, watching Leary with an expression that was both knowing and resigned. I take it you've made up your mind, Braddon said. Leary smirked faintly. You sound surprised. Braddon scoffed. Not surprised, just hoping you'd come to your senses. He sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. But I knew this would happen. We saw a man appear out of the mist and propose an adventure that bards will sing about for centuries. What else would I expect? Leary turned fully toward him. You don't have to come. Braddon shot him a flat look. Of course I'm coming. Someone has to make sure you don't get yourself killed in whatever mist-drenched nightmare we're walking into. Leary huffed a quiet laugh, but there was warmth behind it. Braddon might have grumbled and argued, but in the end, he had never once left Leary's side. Behind Braddon, more of the men were stirring. Some were already gathering their weapons, fastening their cloaks, adjusting their gear. The decision had been made before Leary had even spoken it aloud. The warriors of Connacht had never been ones to turn away from the unknown, especially not when there was glory to be won. By the time the first streaks of light touched the misty horizon, stood at the water's edge, waiting as the dawn turned the mist to a pale golden haze. And then, just as before, the veil of fog parted, and Finian stepped through. He did not look surprised to see them waiting. If anything, there was the faintest glint of satisfaction in his ageless eyes. He swept his gaze over them as though taking their measure one last time. Then he met Leary's stare and nodded. "You have chosen well, Prince of Connacht." Leary lifted his chin. "Just tell us where to go." Finian extended his hand toward the mist. "Follow me." Without another word, Leary stepped forward, and the mist swallowed him whole. The warriors of Connacht followed, and the world they had always known vanished behind them. The mist curled around Leary's shoulders like ghostly fingers, cool and damp against his skin. He had walked only a few steps beyond the fire, yet already the world behind him was fatting. The sounds of his men, the quiet clinking of armor, the murmur of conversation, were swallowed by the dense fog, stretched thin and distant, as if carried away by unseen hands. He did not look back. Ahead, Finian moved in silence, his silver cloak barely distinguishable from the shifting mist. His steps made no sound, but Leary could sense his presence, guiding them deeper into the unknown. His warriors followed closely behind, their ranks tight, their weapons held firm. The mist was thicker than any fog they had ever known, dense, weighty, wrapping around them in slow, swirling waves. For a moment, Leary felt weightless, as though the ground beneath his feet had softened. No longer solid, but something else, something in between. A shiver ran down his spine. The world was changing. The farther they walked, the harder it became to hold on to his sense of direction. He knew his men were behind him, could hear the faintest sounds of their movements, yet the mist muffled everything, stretching space and sound in unnatural ways. Then, one by one, those sounds began to vanish. At first, it was subtle. The soft thud of boots against earth became quieter, the rustle of cloaks less distinct. Then, the footsteps disappeared entirely, swallowed by the silence. Leary stopped walking. He turned his head slightly, intending to check on his men, but they were gone. A rush of cold flooded his chest. The warriors who had been beside him only moments ago were nowhere to be seen. There was only mist, endless, shifting mist. His grip tightened around the hilt of his sword. Braddon, his voice cut through the silence, but there was no answer. Aeon, nothing. Leary's pulse quickened, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. He took a slow step back, his hand resting lightly on his blade, the weight of it grounding him. He had seen many things in his life, raiders and warbands, bloodied battlefields and burning villages. But this was something else, something unnatural. His breath came slower now, measured and careful. Finian. The name left his lips in a whisper, but it was enough. From the mist ahead, a shadow moved. Finian emerged, as though he had always been standing there, as though the veil had merely chosen to reveal him now. expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes held something sharp, not unkind, but knowing. "You are in between," Finian said quietly. "A place that is neither here nor there, a threshold." Leary exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. "Where are my men?" "They are here," Finian gestured to the mist around them. "And yet they are not." Leary's fingers flexed against the hilt of his sword. "That's not an answer." Finian regarded him for a long moment before speaking again. "The world is not as solid as men believe. There are places where it thins, where the fabric of one reality brushes against another." He tilted his head slightly. "You and your men walk through such a place now. The mist is not merely mist, it is a veil." Leary's jaw tightened. He had heard the old tales, the ones whispered by firesides on winter nights, stories of men stepping into fog and never returning. He had never put much faith in them before, but now he was walking in one. He glanced around once more, his senses stretching for something familiar, something real. But there was only mist. "What happens if we stray from the path?" Leary asked. Finian's gaze did not waver. "Then you will not return." A muscle twitched in Leary's jaw. He did not like this. He did not like unseen forces dictating his course. He did not like being at the mercy of something he could not fight. Finian seemed to sense his unease. "Trust the path," he said, his voice quieter now. "You are meant to walk it. Your men are not lost, only separate. When the veil lifts, you will be whole again." Leary inhaled slowly. He did not trust easily, and he trusted magic even less. But there was no other way forward. With a final glance at the mist around him, he took a step. The moment his foot touched the ground, the world shifted. The mist around him trembled, then began to move. It swirled in great arcs, twisting in on itself, folding like waves upon an unseen shore. Leary's vision blurred for a moment. He felt as though he were falling, then solid ground. The mist parted like a curtain, and suddenly the world was different. Leary stumbled slightly, blinking against the sudden brightness. His breath caught in his chest. The land before him was unlike anything he had ever seen. The sky stretched vast and endless, deep shades of gold, and violet swirling together like liquid fire. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet and unfamiliar, rich and intoxicating. And the trees, if they could be called trees, rose impossibly high, their canopies shimmering with faint, pulsing light. The grass beneath his boots was soft, almost silken, carrying a faint glow as though lit from within. And standing nearby, his warriors. They were all there, blinking and dazed, some gripping their weapons, others rubbing their eyes as if trying to clear them. Braddon stood closest, his stance wary, his brow furrowed in confusion. He caught Leary's gaze. "What in the gods' names is this place?" Before Leary could answer, Finian stepped forward, unaffected by the transition. His silver cloak moved effortlessly with the shifting breeze. "This," Finian said, voice steady, "is the neither night nor day, but something in between. The trees, tall as towers, pulsed with a soft inner glow, their leaves shifting like liquid silver in a wind that could not be felt. The air was rich, thick with the scent of something sweet and intoxicating. But beneath it was something colder, something that felt like a whisper at the back of the mind. His warriors had fallen into silence. Even Braddon, who could always be counted on to mutter some sharp remark, stood rigid beside him, his hand resting tensely on the hilt of his sword. Leary knew the feeling well. It was the stillness before battle, the sensation of stepping onto unknown ground, where every shadow might be hiding an enemy. Finian moved ahead of them, his silver cloak trailing behind him like a wisp of mist. His posture was calm, unbothered, but there was an alertness in his step, a careful precision that did not go unnoticed by Leary. "This is a Vermeer," Finian said at last, his voice soft, but carrying in the unnatural quiet. "It is one of the oldest lands in the otherworld, a place that has stood unchanged since before mortal men walked their own lands." Leary exhaled slowly. "It doesn't feel unchanged." Finian glanced at him, a faint smirk on his lips, but there was no humor in his eyes. "No, it does not." They began walking, their footsteps barely making a sound against the soft, glowing grass. There was no true sun here, no true moon, and yet everything was bathed in a strange, shifting light, sometimes golden, sometimes blue, flickering like flame without a source. The silence pressed around them. Then the whispers began. Leary froze mid-step. He wasn't sure at first if he had actually heard them. Faint voices, distant and drifting, as though the wind itself was speaking. The sound was soft, indistinct, but it brushed against his mind rather than his ears, stirring a deep unease in his chest. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Braddon stiffened beside him. What in the gods' names was that? Finian did not stop walking. "Do not listen." Easier said than done. The whispers grew stronger. Leary couldn't make out the words, but he could feel them. They slithered at the edges of his thoughts, tugging, searching, like unseen fingers reaching for something hidden deep in his mind. He shook his head sharply. Focus. Then ahead of them, the mist thickened. Leary saw them before he understood what they were. Shapes not men, not quite, but shadowy figures, their forms wavering as if they were half formed, half forgotten. They stood scattered among the trees, still and silent, their heads tilted slightly as though watching. Leary's breath tightened in his chest. He reached for his sword. "Do not draw your blade," Finian said quietly. Leary did not look at him. "They don't look friendly." Finian kept walking, unconcerned. "They are not enemies." Braddon's voice was tight. "They don't look like friends either." The shadowed figures did not move. They did not breathe. They barely seemed to exist. And yet, they were undeniably there. Their followed thickly, and now Finian finally looked at him, his gaze unreadable. Now they are nothing, neither alive nor dead, only shadows of what once was. A shudder passed through Leary's spine. He forced himself to look forward, but in the corner of his vision, the figures remained, standing, waiting, unmoving. His men followed behind him in tight formation. No one spoke as they walked deeper into Vermeer. The shadows grew denser, the mist swirling between them. The trees loomed taller, their glowing leaves flickering in strange rhythms, as if breathing. The ground beneath them felt less solid, as though they were walking on something that had never been meant to hold weight. Then the light shifted. Ahead of them, through the thinning mist, a structure emerged. Vast and towering, its walls were smooth and golden, gleaming with an unnatural brilliance. It was neither a castle nor a fortress, yet it was both. It pulsed with an eerie glow, as though the very air around it bent and shimmered at its presence. Finian stopped. "We have arrived," he said softly. Leary exhaled, gripping the hilt of his sword just to remind himself that he was still real, still solid, still here. Braddon took a step closer, his voice low. "That's where she is, isn't it?" Finian nodded. Yes. Leary felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was not just another battle. This was not just another war. This was something else entirely. He stared up at the golden halls of Vermeer, and then, without another word, he stepped forward. The golden halls of Vermeer loomed before them, vast and terrible in their stillness. The structure did not seem built, as much as summoned into existence, its walls smooth as flowing water, yet unyielding as the mountains. It pulsed faintly, an unnatural glow flickering through the polished surface like veins of molten gold. Leary tightened his grip on his sword as he stepped forward. The air was heavier here, thick with something unseen pressing against his chest. His warriors followed behind him, their formation instinctively closing as they neared the entrance. Finian walked ahead, his movements measured, his expression unreadable. This place was not always his, Finian said, his voice carrying strangely in the unnatural silence. Gale took it, shaped it, bent it to his will. It is his stronghold now, but Vermeer was something else once. Leary glanced at him. What was it? Finian's gaze lingered on the golden walls, as though remembering something long buried. A place of passage, a threshold between what was and what could be. Before Gale, it belonged to no one. Braddon, walking just behind them, scowled. And now, Finian exhaled. Now, it belongs to a man who was never meant to rule it. They reached the great doors, towering slabs of gold, carved with twisting symbols that seemed to shift when Leary tried to focus on them. His pulse quickened. He had seen many fortresses before, many battlements standing defiant against invasion. But this was different. This was not built to keep men out. It was built to keep something gripping their weapons. Then a voice. It did not come from the doors. It did not come from within. It came from everywhere at once. You tread where no mortal should walk. Leary's breath hitched. The voice was layered, as if it belonged to many speaking at once, distant yet near, soft yet unbreakable. The majestic halls seemed to contort, and for the first time in a decade, Leary felt something cold run down his spine. Braddon, ever the first to speak, drew his sword, lifting his chin. We've heard worse. The air thickened. The mist that had clung to the edges of the fortress surged forward, creeping over the threshold like living tendrils, coiling between their legs, wrapping around the base of the golden doors. Finian stepped forward, unshaken. You have no right to keep her. Silence. Then the voice came again, slow, deliberate. She chose to stay. Leary's fingers clenched against the hilt of his sword. A lie. It had to be. Finian's expression remained composed, but something in his posture changed. His hands curled slightly, his shoulders tensed. Let us pass. The mist hesitated. It curled higher, shifting in unnatural patterns, swirling in slow, hypnotic waves. Leary's heartbeat was steady, but his instinct screamed that something was watching. Then, without warning, the doors opened. The movement was silent, unnatural, as if the golden slabs had never been solid at all. They parted like the surface of a still pond disturbed by an unseen hand, revealing a vast, empty corridor beyond. No guards, no torches, no signs of life, only darkness. Finian exhaled, stepping forward without hesitation. Leary glanced at Braddon, who lifted a brow. Well, Braddon muttered, this is a bloody trap. Leary smirked faintly, obviously, and then, without another word, he stepped inside. The warriors of Connect followed. The doors sealed behind them. The world of men was now far behind, and the warlord of Evermere was waiting. The doors behind them had vanished, not closed, but vanished entirely. The golden threshold where they had entered was now only smooth, unbroken wall, as if no entrance had ever existed. Leary exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword. The weight of it felt distant, the leather grip cool against his palm. The silence in the corridor was absolute. No echoes, no air movement, not even the faintest breath of life. It was wrong. The warriors of Connect fanned out behind him, their movements careful, their footfalls impossibly quiet against the glass-like floor. The walls pulsed with a dim golden glow, but the light did not touch the air. It was trapped within the metal itself, as though the very structure of the fortress was alive. Finian strode ahead, his silver cloak trailing behind him, unbothered by the unnatural stillness. Leary matched his pace. Tell me what's coming, he murmured. Finian did not look at him. You already know. Leary's jaw tightened. He did know. He had felt it since they had stepped through the mist, since they had first set foot in Evermere. They were being watched not by men, not by anything living, but by something else. A whisper of movement stirred vision. Leary's head snapped toward it, but there was nothing. Just empty golden halls stretching endlessly in both directions. Another shift, this time behind them. Braddon froze, his sword half drawn. We're not alone. No one breathed. Then the light changed. The glow of the walls dimmed, swallowed by something darker, something unseen. And with it, the air grew heavy, thick with the weight of something unnatural. Leary turned slowly, his instincts roaring. And then they emerged. From the darkness between the golden walls, from the very air itself, shadows began to take form. Figures tall and silent, their faces obscured, their bodies shifting like mist caught in a windless void. They did not move like men. They did not breathe. They simply appeared, stepping forward with the slow, deliberate certainty of something that had no need to hurry. Gale's army. Not flesh, not blood, only shadows. The warriors of Connacht reacted instantly. Braddon snapped his sword free, the whisper of steel ringing against the unnatural hush. The others followed, their weapons glinting in the faint shifting light. Leary did not move. He watched. He waited. The figures did not charge. They did not lunge or raise weapons. They only stood, watching. Then one of them, the closest, tilted its head slightly, as though studying them. Its form wavered, a deep, unnatural blackness rippling beneath the surface of its body, as though it had no true shape. Leary's breath caught. The shadow's movements were wrong. It wasn't the way a man moved. It was too fluid, too effortless, like water shifting between cracks in stone. Then, without a sound, the figure moved. Not toward him, through him. The cold that hit him was like nothing he had ever felt. Not winter's chill, not the bite of icy wind. This was deeper, older. It was the feeling of something hollow, something that should not be. Leary stumbled back, his breath stolen from his lungs, his vision blurring for a moment, his body heavy. Distantly, he heard Braddon curse, saw other men recoil as the shadows passed through them like fog. Leary gasped, steadying himself, forcing breath into his chest. His limbs felt solid again, real, but the memory of the cold lingered deep in his bones. Finian stood ahead of them, unshaken. "Their weapons cannot kill you," Finian said, his voice calm. "But neither can yours kill them." Braddon exhaled sharply. "That's comforting." Leary shook off the lingering cold, forcing his mind to focus. "Then, what do we do?" Finian turned toward him, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that looked like respect. "We don't fight," he said simply. "We pass through." Leary blinked. "Through," Finian nodded. "They are not meant for battle. They are meant for fear." His gaze swept over the warriors, all standing tense, uneasy, gripping their swords as though ready for an attack that would never come. "And if you give them fear, they will take it. They will take all of you." The words struck deep, chilling Leary in a way even the shadows could not. He understood. This was not a battle of steel. It was a battle of will. And if they gave in, if they let the whispers take hold, if they let doubt fester, they would become like the forgotten. Lost within a Vermeer. Shadows among the shadows. Leary squared his shoulders. He exhaled once, slow and steady. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. The shadows did not move. He walked through them, the same unnatural cold brushing against his skin. But he did not stop. One step, then another. And then the light shifted. The golden glow of the walls pulsed. And suddenly, the corridor was empty. No shadows, no whispers. Only the warriors of Connacht, whole and unbroken, standing on the other side. Finian gave a small nod. Braddon let out a breath that was half a scoff, half a relieved chuckle. If I never do that again, it'll be too soon. Leary turned toward Finian, his pulse steady but sharp. They weren't real, were they? Finian regarded him carefully. They were as real as you let them be. Leary exhaled, glancing back at his warriors. All of them had made it through. Some were shaken, but they were whole. And now, ahead of them, the fortress stretched forward, silent, waiting. They had passed the first test, but Leary knew, deep in his bones, that it would not be the last. The silence after passing through the shadowed army was brief, too brief. Leary's instincts screamed at him. It wasn't over. The golden corridor stretched ahead, shifting and alive, but the unnatural quiet carried attention that had not been there before. Finian moved forward without hesitation, his silver cloak trailing behind him like mist. Leary followed, his warriors close behind, their hands still gripping their weapons. Braddon's voice was low. I don't like this. Neither did Leary. They continued forward, their boots making no sound against the smooth, impossible floors. The glow in the walls flickered faintly, as if the fortress itself was breathing. Then, ahead of them, the golden halls began to twist, not physically, but something about them shifted, as though space itself was unraveling. The walls stretched farther than they should have. The ceiling rose higher, and a dark mist began to seep from the very air, curling and shifting, whispering as it moved. Then the whispers turned to screams. The shadows returned, but this time they did not stand still. They came forward in a rush. A tide of formless figures surged from the mist, their movements faster, sharper, deadlier. This was no longer a test of will. This was war. Leary drew his sword in a single motion, steel flashing as he slashed through the first of them. His blade cut through the misty form, but it did not stop. The shadow split apart, then reformed behind him. Braddon cursed and swung his axe, cleaving through one of the figures, but the blade passed through as though slicing air. The warrior staggered, barely dodging as the figure lunged forward, its form stretching unnaturally. They don't die, one of the men shouted. Leary gritted his teeth. Then Finian's voice, rising above the chaos. Strike with fire and light. Do not fight them as men, fight them as shadows. Leary did not hesitate. He shifted his stance, changing his grip on the sword, adjusting to the way the shadows moved. The figures were not men. They did not bleed, did not break, but they could be cut not as He sliced sideways, his blade sweeping through the darkness in a broad arc. The mist-like figure shattered, breaking apart in swirling tendrils of black smoke that did not reform. Finian raised his hand, and a pulse of silver light flared from his palm. The shadows recoiled. Some vanished entirely in its glow, their forms burning away as though touched by the dawn. Leary's warriors adjusted quickly. Their strikes became wider, faster, meant not to kill, but to unravel. They fought like wind against wind, blade against the void. The battle raged. The fortress pulsed with every strike, as though the very walls felt the violence, felt the war being waged within them. And then through the mist, through the chaos, Gale appeared. He stepped forward as if from nowhere, as though he had always been there, waiting. Tall, cloaked in flowing black, his form shifted as the shadows did. But his presence was something greater, something deeper. He was no mere phantom, no lingering shade. He was the master of this place. His voice cut through the battle like a blade. Fools, the shadows froze at once. The warriors of Connacht pulled back instinctively, their weapons still raised, but the storm of mist had stilled. Gale turned his gaze toward Finian first. "You should have known better," he murmured, his voice a soft, terrible thing. "You cannot take back what has chosen to stay." Leary's breath tightened, the lie again. Before he could speak, Finian raised his hand. Silver light flared once more, surging forward. Gale did not move. The light touched him and passed through. Finian's eyes widened. Gale's lips curved into a slow, cold smile. "You thought I was bound by the same rules as the others." Leary moved. He didn't wait, didn't hesitate. This was not a war of words. This was a fight. He lunged forward, sword flashing, and struck. Gale caught the blade with his bare hand. The room shuddered. The mist twisted violently around them. The golden walls trembled, as though something vast had stirred beneath them. Leary's sword should have cleaved through flesh. It did not. Gale's fingers tightened around the steel, and black veins spread from his touch, darkening the metal, as though it were being consumed. "You do not belong here, mortal," Gale whispered. Leary's vision blurred. The world tilted. Space bent inward. Then Finian moved. He surged forward, his silver blade flashing, cutting through Gale's phantom body. The warlord released his grip as Finian's strike forced him back, but only slightly. Gale laughed. "Brave," he murmured, "but foolish." Finian's voice was sharp. "Your reign ends here." Gale tilted his head slightly, his form flickering. "Does it?" Then the entire fortress shook. The walls cracked, not physically, but like light fractured through glass. The golden glow of Evermere dimmed. Leary's vision steadied, but his breath caught. Gale was fatting, not in defeat, not in death. He was leaving. Leary surged forward. Coward. Gale's smile was as thin as mist. "You think this is over." His form rippled, then vanished. The shadows collapsed. hard, sword still raised. But the enemy was gone. The silence that followed was vast. Braddon let out a slow exhale. I don't suppose that means we won. Finian was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, "No," he murmured. "It means we have what we came for." Leary turned sharply, his breath sharp as his gaze locked onto the figure standing at the far end of the chamber. Alicia, she was untouched by time. Her dark hair flowed over her shoulders, her silver gown shimmering like moonlight on still water. Her skin was pale, her features delicate, but there was something unreadable in her eyes, something that made Leary hesitate. Finian stepped past him. He had not spoken, had not moved since she had appeared, but now his breath came sharp, and there was something in his expression, not just longing, but disbelief. Alicia, her name left his lips as a whisper. She blinked slowly, watching him as though seeing a memory come to life. For a moment, she did not move. Then she ran to him. Finian caught her, his arms wrapping around her, as though she might vanish if he let go. Alicia buried her face against his shoulder, and for the first time since Leary had met the warrior from the other world, he saw him shake. Finian held Alicia tightly, as though she might slip away if he let go. His breath was uneven, his grip fierce. "I thought you were gone," he whispered, his voice raw, stripped of the steady resolve he had carried until now. Alicia clung to him, but something in her posture was hesitant. When she finally pulled away, her fingers still curled against his cloak. Her gaze flickered past him, landing on the golden walls of Evermere. "You shouldn't have come for me," she murmured. The words struck like a blade. Finian stiffened. His hands fell to his sides, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" Leary frowned. Something was wrong. He had been so focused on the battle, on the warlord, on the escape, that he hadn't considered the most obvious question. Alicia had been here for years, held captive in a realm beyond mortal reach. And yet, she was untouched, not a prisoner in chains, not weary or wounded. She had stayed, not been kept. Alicia lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was not kept here. I chose to stay." Silence. The warriors of Connacht stood frozen, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Finian's expression did not change, but something inside him cracked, something Leary could feel in the weight of his stillness. No, the word was quiet but unshaken. "That isn't true." Alicia met his gaze, and though her eyes were filled with sorrow, there was no doubt in them. "It is." Finian's jaw tightened. "Gale stole you. He took you from me." She exhaled softly. "He did, at first." Her gaze drifted around the golden halls as though seeing them anew. "But Evermere is not what you think it is. Gale ruled it, yes, but he was not its master. This place is older than him, older than everything you know." And she hesitated, and in that moment, Leary saw it not fear, not regret, but something deeper. Understanding. "I stayed," she places where time does not touch, where knowledge does not end, where a path once walked will never be walked the same way again. Her voice was distant now, as though she were speaking from somewhere beyond the present moment. I thought I would find answers here. I thought I would see something that no other had seen before. And I did. She turned back to Finian. But as you stand before me, I realize that for every discovery I made, a new one replaced it. The mysteries of this place are endless, and if I stayed any longer, I would become one of them. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling slightly. I am ready to leave now. The words fell over them like a breath of wind before a storm. Finian exhaled sharply, closing his eyes, just for a moment. Then he nodded. Then we go. Now, Leary half expected the fortress to resist, to hold her back, to summon its shadows and voices to reclaim her. But nothing happened. There were no more phantoms, no more whispers, only silence. And then, as Finian led Alicia forward, the golden walls of Evermere began to fade. Like mist at dawn, the fortress unraveled, and suddenly they were standing somewhere else entirely. The world had shifted around them. Where before there had been the unnatural glow of Evermere, now they stood upon a rolling field of silver grass, stretching endlessly beneath a sky painted in hues of violet and gold. The air smelled of honey and river mist, of something ancient and untouched by time. Finian did not hesitate. He turned to Alicia, still holding her close. This is Mag Dasheo. Leary knew, without needing an explanation, that this place was different. This was not Evermere. This was not Gale's stronghold. This was a land untouched by war, by darkness, by anything of the mortal world. The warriors of Connacht stood behind him, their breaths slow, their movements uncertain. They had stepped into a world beyond their own. Alicia looked around, her breath soft. I never thought I'd see it again. Finian studied her for a long moment. You are free now. She turned to him, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Am I? Leary looked between them, unease creeping into his gut. There was something in her voice, something he couldn't place. But before he could speak, Finian turned to Leary and his warriors. You have done what no mortals have ever done before, Finian said. You have fought through Evermere. You have walked between worlds and not been lost. He gestured toward the land behind him, stretching into the eternal twilight of Mag Dashego. And now I offer you a choice. Leary's pulse slowed. A choice. Finian nodded. Stay for a year. Be honored as warriors of the otherworld. My daughter, Dara, is fairer than the sun, and she will be yours, Prince of Connacht. Your men will each be given a bride of their own. You will feast in halls that do not fade, drink wine that never turns bitter, walk where no mortal has walked before. Braddon exhaled sharply. And what's the catch? Finian smiled faintly. There is none. Only that you must not dismount from your steeds when you return home. Leary narrowed his eyes. He knew enough of otherworld bargains he saw something in their faces, longing, and he understood why. They had lived their lives on battlefields, in blood and hardship, and now they stood in a place of peace, a place where death did not reach. Finian extended his hand. "Come, stay for a while." Leary exhaled slowly. He had made many choices before, but none like this, and for the first time in his life, he was not sure what his heart would say. The air in Magdashego was unlike anything Leary had ever breathed, light as mist, sweet as honey, thick with something just beyond sensation. Every inhale left warmth in his chest. Every exhale carried something away, though he could not tell what. His warriors stood behind him in stunned silence. These were men who had known only the harshness of the mortal world, cold nights spent in damp forests, iron-rimmed mornings of battle, the bite of steel, the hunger of long campaigns. But here there was no suffering. The sky stretched in hues of violet and gold, its colors shifting like an ever-changing dawn. There was no sun, no moon, yet light filled the air, casting a warm, eternal glow upon the land. The grass beneath their boots shimmered silver, softer than the finest furs. In the distance, hills rolled like waves, their peaks crowned with mist, and great rivers of light cut through the valleys, their waters reflecting stars that did not exist. This was not a place of men. It was something else. Braddon turned in a slow circle, his brows furrowed. He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't have the words." Aeon, the oldest among them, ran a hand through his beard. "That's because there aren't any." Leary said nothing. His heart beat slow, steady, but the weight of something unspoken pressed into his ribs. It was beautiful. It was too beautiful. Finian strode ahead, his silver cloak flowing behind him as he gestured across the valley. "This is the land of Silver Cloud, the heart of Magdashego. This will be your home." The words settled uncomfortably in Leary's chest. His men did not seem to share his hesitation. They were already walking forward, their eyes wide, their hands brushing against the grass and trees as though to prove they were real. Some laughed. Others whispered prayers, unsure whether to kneel or run. Braddon grinned. "I've never seen anything like it." Finian turned toward them, his expression unreadable. "You have walked through mist and shadow. You have faced the terrors of Vermeer. You have passed into a world where no mortals have ever stepped." He paused, letting the words settle. "And you are welcome here." A soft sound carried through the air music. Leary froze. It was not being played. It was simply there, woven into the very breath of the world. A melody too perfect, too distant, as though the land itself was singing. Something tightened in his chest. "This isn't natural," he murmured. Something about this place felt like a dream. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Dreams were meant to fade. Finian led them forward, toward a great hall that shimmered in the distance, its spires rising like smoke from the ground. The walls were woven from silver and pearl, not built with hands, but formed from something older, something woven into the very bones of the world. Leary and his men were led inside, and there everything changed. Long tables stretched across the chamber, filled with golden fruits and goblets of deep red wine, meats that shimmered under the glow of unseen fire, bowls of shining berries that smelled of summer and memory. The scent alone made Leary's mouth water, and around him, his warriors hesitated only a moment before eating. One bite, and they forgot the cold of the road. One sip, and they forgot the ache of their wounds. Leary did not eat. He sat at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood, watching as his men laughed, drank, feasted as though they had never known war. And then the women entered. They stepped from nowhere, as if they had always been there, drifting across the hall like figures from a dream. They were beautiful, impossibly so, their hair flowing like silk, their eyes gleaming like starlight. They moved without sound, without effort, as though they were part of the music that never stopped. One stepped toward Leary. She was tall, golden-haired, her eyes deep as the sky itself. She smiled, and something inside him lurched. "I am Dara of the Sun," she said, her voice soft as a whispered oath. "And I have been waiting for you." Leary's breath caught. A strange, weightless feeling settled into his chest. He had made many choices in his life. This would be the hardest one yet. The feast lasted through the night and into what should have been dawn, though the sky never changed. There was no sun, no moon, no shifting of the stars. The air remained warm, the light eternal, as though time itself had forgotten to move. Leary sat at the head of the long table, untouched food and wine before him, watching. His warriors had already surrendered to this place. They laughed, their voices rising in the golden hall, their hands wrapped around goblets of wine that never emptied, their plates never bare. They had eaten the fruit of the other world, tasted its sweetness, and now there was no hunger left in them. And then the women had come. The fairy folk had drifted into the hall as if they had always been there, stepping from the very air itself, their presence too natural to question. Each of them was beautiful beyond mortal measure, golden-haired and dark-eyed, silver-veiled and starlit. Their forms moved as though they were part of the music that never ceased. They had not spoken at first. They had only looked, and one by one, Leary's men had looked back. First, it was a glance across the feast table, a lingering smile, then a brush of fingers when reaching for a goblet, then a whispered word, a laugh, a hushed promise, and suddenly they were gone, vanishing into the golden halls, hand in hand with women not of this world. Leary saw it happen, one by one. He saw Braddon resist at first, scowling as a dark-haired beauty leaned into him, her laughter like a river over smooth stone. He saw Aeon sigh, shaking his head, but allowing His cup remained full, his plate untouched. The music pressed against his mind, wrapping around his ribs, pulling, urging. But he did not move. Then she sat beside him, Dara of the sun. She did not speak at first. She simply sat, her golden hair spilling over her shoulders, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She did not try to take his hand. She did not touch him, but she was there, and her presence was enough. "You do not eat," she murmured after a long silence. Leary did not answer. She turned to him fully now, her eyes like the deepest part of a summer sky. "Nor do you drink. Your men have accepted their fate. Why do you resist?" Leary exhaled slowly. "Because I still remember." Dara tilted her head slightly. "Remember what?" He met her gaze. "The cold, the rain, the battlefields of the mortal world, the weight of iron in his hands, the taste of sweat and blood, the struggle, the fight, the life that was real." Dara smiled softly, and yet they do not. Leary turned his head slightly, and his stomach tightened. His warriors had returned to the hall, or had they ever left? They were changed. Their eyes, once sharp, were softer now. Their movements slower, heavier, not with exhaustion, but with contentment. Dara's voice was soft, unpressed. "Will you not choose too?" Leary's breath was slow, steady, measured. He did not answer. He only watched and waited.